It's about pension cash out. Why study these? The U.S. Provides large tax incentives to encourage private pension saving, and these are very costly items in the federal budget. There are tax penalties for early withdrawals, and a large fraction of pension plans have cash-out options. That is, dollars are at risk prior to retirement of being taken out of the system, which would kind of defeat the purpose of the tax advantage aspect of it. And so we're interested in how widespread pension cash-out is, and does it harm retirement preparedness. So in this paper, we'll use a long panel of the HRS. We can follow people in the HRS for more than 20 years. And we're going to look at some cohort effects. Have cash-out propensities changed with varying cohorts over time? And I think for us, the most interesting thing, we're going to relate cash-out choices to retirement security outcomes far down the line, looking at people early 70s as a function of what they did substantially earlier in their careers. So we'll be looking at 20 years of HRS data. But first, let's remind ourselves of some important trends in labor force participation and in the macroeconomy. Participation of men has been rising at older ages, as you can see, particularly 60 to 64. I didn't put age 70 and above, but that's actually been rising very rapidly also. For women, the increases have been even larger, as you can see, going from about 35% among those 60 to 64 up to around 50%. So large increases. That means the cohorts that we'll be looking at will have different job separation behaviors, because the later cohorts will be less likely to retire because they're in the labor force longer, and more likely that a job separation will come either from unemployment or just simply changing jobs because they're in the labor force longer. And of course, the macroeconomy has had some gyrations. This is to remind you of what happened here. The solid line is housing prices, the most jagged line is stocks, and then the other one is the unemployment rate. And keep in mind, say 2008 is a particularly important year. That's when the unemployment rate started to go up. That will affect our cohorts differentially, as we'll see. The younger cohorts often were retired by the time the financial crisis happened, whereas the younger cohorts were more immediately affected, but we just keep that in the back of our minds. So we're going to compare three groups in the HRS. Their start ages are 51 to 56. Those are incoming, every 6 years HRS brings a new cohort, age 51 to 56, under similar circumstances, and so they're recruited in the same way. They have the same questionnaire. The data are processed in the same way, so you can do very effective cohort comparisons by looking at that age band. And so those are the three groups we're going to look at, 92, 98, and 2004, and follow them for 8 years. And so their age in 2008, I put this in because to remind ourselves that the 2004 cohort, they're age 55 to 60 in 2008, which is when the Great Recession unemployment started going up. So they're going to be affected differentially. The 1992 cohort is pretty much out of the labor force, or at least substantially out of the labor force by the time of the Great Recession. So we'll want to keep that in mind. We'll follow each of these cohorts for 8 years and look at their cash-out behavior. This is a schematic from an old paper I did with Stan Panis in 2006, and it shows the various pathways that can happen. If you have a DC plan, for example, you may or may not have a lump sum distribution option. Almost all do, but there are a few that don't. If you have a DB plan, many fewer have a lump sum distribution option. If you separate and have a DB plan, you might leave the benefits there for the future. You might draw current benefits. You might have a lump sum distribution option. If so, you might take a lump sum distribution. If you take a lump sum distribution, you might annuitize. You might roll into an IRA, or you might cash out. And the cash out line is what we're interested in here. And, well, the other ones also, but primarily cash out. Cash out doesn't necessarily harm retirement preparedness because people could invest the money, or they could put it into durables or into the home, which is a form of saving also, or they could engage in current consumption. And I guess that's kind of the fear that lawmakers have, is that people will squander this money on current consumption. And all those tax dollars have been ineffective in providing retirement security. Over this time period, as people know, big shift from DB to DC plans. You look at the fraction having DC plans, for example, on the left, and it's gone from around 33% up to in the high 40s, and a corresponding decline in DB plans. The vast majority of DC plans allow lump sum distribution. It says 80% here. That's probably underreported, but there's a difference between the worker contributions and the employer contributions as to a lump sum distribution. Many fewer in DB plans. So here is basically the same thing, showing, this is really to show the counts that we have to do the analysis. And so in the 92 cohort, 637 over those 8 years had a job separation and had a DC plan. 956 had a job separation, had a DB plan, and you can see the numbers are pretty good. We wish they were larger, but we're operating in the area of 600 to 900 observations on each side of that. Well, this is kind of shows you what the cohort trend is in cash out. The 92 cohort over 8 years, around 12.5% of people with job separation cashed out a DC plan. 1998 cohort, same. But the 2004 cohort, 18% cashed out. So an increasing trend towards cash out. DB plans, not as dramatic, but somewhat of an increase in cash out, going from 17% to 20%. And what are people doing with the cash out on DB plans? 92 cohort, 25% spent the money, 56% saved the money, 19% used it to pay off debt. Compare that and contrast that with the 2004 cohort, where spent went up somewhat, saved went down by a lot, and debt payments went up very, very substantially. Our first indication of uses of the cash out money for economic distress, to address economic distress. This is also, I guess, emphasized by HRS question. When people separate from jobs, HRS asks, why did you separate from that job? And attributed to by people in the 2004 is a rather large increase in the business closed or let go, that is, became a job separation at the employer's, not at the employee's will. And you can see that the other aspect in this is a decline in the fraction of job separations into retirement, as explained by the increasing labor force participation over time. We want to keep in mind this business closed and let go among in the 2004 cohort. DB, we don't really see that same thing. Well, let's, the other aspect is to look at shocks around job separation. The HRS asked people aspects of job separation, and this is, for us anyway, was quite interesting. Among those people separating with a pension, the fraction who cashed out overall, that's 19%, that's in bold at the top. But then this is stratified by reasons, people, or factors that were associated with the job separation. Among those who lost health insurance when they separated from the job, 36% of those cashed out. Among those whose health became worse when they separated, 27% cashed out. Among those who had fallen behind on their mortgage, 55% cashed out, and those who stated any other mortgage issues, 47% cash out. So you kind of look at this, and the impression, at least that we have, is that a lot of these cash outs were associated with people having financial problems of various kinds, often associated with Great Recession. We did some probate estimation that basically verifies kind of what I just showed you, so I think I'll just skip that. The other thing we wanted to do is focus on the long-run outcomes, focusing on the 1992 cohort, following them for 20 years to find out what happened to people who cashed out compared to non-cash out, and address the issue of what are there differences in types, and can we attribute anything to cash out per se, or is it the shocks or something else? So we will compare cash out with the non-cash out population along the lines of income, wealth, health, and vital status. About 20% had died by 2012. And so we'll distinguish three groups in the 1992 cohort: those who never separated from a job, separated from their job but never cashed out, and separated from a job and cashed out at least once. And we want to look at differences in 2012 outcomes across these three groups. So this table shows a lot of, I think, difficulty of coming to conclusions about this. These are, let's look first at the 1992 measures for those who were retired by 2012. And among those who never separated from a job to non-retirement state, that is to say, transitioned from one job to another or transitioned into unemployment, those people who did not ever do that had the highest wealth in 1992. So wealth is predictive of that not happening to you. This is ex ante. The numbers in the 1992 measures are ex ante. So the people who are better off ex ante had better labor market outcomes from that perspective. The people who separated for a job but did not cash out had about 10% less wealth. This is in log terms, so 11.68 is 10% more than 11.58. Their income is higher, and their health is the people who never separated and separated about the same health. This is a scalar where higher is better. Those people who separated from a job and cashed out had substantially less wealth. This 11.23 is about 70% of the wealth of the people in the top line, lower household income, and worse health. So these worse outcomes predicted the worse labor market outcomes. So one problem of finding out the effects of cash out is that these people ex ante, before they cashed out, were worse off than people who did not cash out. So we see there's a problem understanding what the effect of cash out was. If we look at the 2012 measures for these same people, we see that if anything, these relative measures got worse for the people who cashed out. Now, log wealth is 10.48, which is substantially below the 11.75, and household income is a lot worse, and health is a lot worse. So ex ante, the people who cashed out were worse off. Ex post, they were even more worse off, or substantially worse off. So we would like to understand more about this. What is leading to these worse outcomes? Are the shocks that we saw are associated with cashing out, initial conditions, or the cash outs themselves? And I think that's the important policy aspect is, are the cash outs themselves harming retirement security, or is it something associated with these people that's correlated with cash outs? And so we will compare baseline and outcomes 20 years later for those with cash out option and those without. We're going to basically use a cash out option as kind of an instrumental variable to try to separate these things. So almost everyone in a DC plan has a cash out option, so we don't have any statistical power in using DC plans. So we use DB plans where about half the people have a cash out option. And so these are people who have DB plans, and this shows whether they self-report that the DB plan has a lump sum distribution option and the outcomes that are associated with people according to that classification. So we see, for example, that people who had the lump sum distribution option survived a little bit better than the people who did not, that the lump sum distribution option led to more cash outs, 17% compared to 11%. So we at least have a little statistical power here to separate these two groups. This is kind of going to be an intention to treat type analysis. Wealth differences are a little bit different. Wealth in 2012 a little bit different, but not hugely. Household income a little bit different, but not hugely. And incomes also a little bit different, but not hugely. So that's kind of what we see. And looking at this, you would not come to the conclusion just looking at this that having a lump sum distribution often made you worse off. If anything, having that option is a little bit better for you than not having it. And it led to more cash outs. So you can see that applying an IV type estimation is not going to produce the outcome that cash outs per se will lead to worse outcomes. We don't see it in this simple cross classification, which is a way of kind of qualitatively displaying what the IV estimation will look like. And so here again is, this is with medians, and we sort of basically see the same thing, so I won't dwell on that, and you kind of look at the ratios. The last measure we want to look at is our measure, Suzanne and my measure of economic preparation for retirement. I've shown you wealth and income. Our measure of economic preparation for retirement takes into account a lot of things that are important from a life cycle perspective. It takes into account differential mortality, all of the resources, uncertainty due to mortality and taxes, assessment of adequacy, and so on. Basically what it does, it starts out people at age 65 to 69 and simulates out a spending path and asks, if they follow that spending path, will they be able to die with high probability with positive wealth? That's kind of the spirit behind us, and it uses uncertainty about healthcare spending and so on. And so that's going to be our measure, and now we want to ask, does cashing out harm that economic preparation for retirement? That's kind of the bottom line. And so we see in our measure that among singles, 52% are adequately prepared. Among married people, 78%. And among those who did not separate, 76% adequately prepared. Among those who didn't cash out, 81%, and those who cashed out, 72%. So we get kind of the same ranking, that people who cashed out are a little bit worse off. But when we look at whether they had the lump sum distribution option or not, we don't see any differential. That's kind of like what the IV estimation. So the last thing I will talk about is briefly about using the lump sum distribution option in a DB plan as an instrumental variable. So here's the setup. For example, wealth depends upon whether somebody cashed out, that's the C, and whether they had a shock, that's the S. And cash outs themselves depend upon the availability of having a cash out option or lump sum distribution option, and S, shock, and we think that U and V are probably correlated, say, by latent health. Under the assumption that the ability to have a cash out option is orthogonal to U and V, we can use that as an instrumental variable. So that's what we're going to do. I'm going to report on that. And so the first stage of the instrumental variables, it does have, the instrument does have predictive power. this is kind of what we saw in that crosstab earlier. The differential between the two was about this 9%. And then in the second stage, we enter some covariates, as you can see here. And here's the outcome. This is supposed to represent the effect of cash outs on these options, having cashed out on these options using this IV approach. And basically what you see is the same thing we saw in that crosstab. The cashing out is associated with better outcomes, not with worse. Health is a little bit higher, log wealth is a little bit higher. Unfortunately, the standard errors are so large that we could not reject any null hypotheses, even if it went in the other direction. We don't have enough power here to get more precise estimates. We did a household analysis that I will skip. And so what we conclude and what we summarize, that for more recent cohorts, fewer job separations, cash out more prevalent, unemployment seemed to be very important for the 2004 cohort we saw in the regressions. I didn't show you that unemployment is associated with higher cash out behavior. And shocks that trigger cash out are some of the things that you see here. And among those with cash outs, they had worse economic and health conditions before they cashed out, so those are predictive of cash out, and even worse outcomes 20 years later. But our preliminary evidence is that the worse outcomes 20 years later, in fact, are not due to cash out, but due to shocks that and initial conditions that these individuals experience. We have low power here. We need to get a hold of the HRS pension details and get a better classification as to who actually has a lump sum distribution option. In the HRS, these are self-reports. You ask of somebody who's age 51, does your pension allow you to take a lump sum at distribution? People don't know. Some people do, but many people do not know. So we've got classification error here, which doesn't harm the, may a little bit harm the IV aspects of it, but its main problem is it reduces the power of the IV overlay. And that's what I have to say.